Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all online this morning to our jointly hosted HPRA HSE webinar on medical device shortages. My name is Nicola Hickey. I'm the HPRA Regulatory and Policy Manager for Medical Devices, and I'll chair the webinar session this morning. I'm joined by two presenters, my colleague Niamh Herlihy, a Regulatory and Policy Assessor in the HPRA Medical Device Department, and by Dr. Ger Flynn, the National Clinical Head of Medical Devices with the HSE. This webinar is a dedicated session for health service personnel involved in the procurement, management and use of medical devices and IVDs in Irish hospitals. So hospital CEOs and risk managers and those involved in procurement, clinical engineering departments, theatre superintendents and hospital laboratories. We have attendees today from HSE, from voluntary and private hospitals, and we're delighted to welcome you today and hope you will find this morning's sessions useful. The objective today really is to raise awareness to new requirements for the notification of interruptions or discontinuations of the supply of certain medical devices. The session today will focus on why this new requirement has been introduced and what it means for health institutions and hospitals in Ireland. Dr. Ger Flynn will outline the process for coordination and management of these notifications within the HSE, and we hope this will help inform you of what you can expect in terms of such notifications from suppliers, and also help you develop your own processes to manage these notifications. Before we start with the formal presentations, I might just run through some housekeeping arrangements. We'll run the two presentations back to back. You will be able to ask questions through the Q&A function on the bottom of your screens. And if you provide your contact details when you're posting these, we can follow up with you afterwards if further clarification is needed, or you can also choose to answer these anonymously. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the two presentations, and we'll take a selection of questions from the chat. We've allocated an hour and a half for this session. We do envisage it to be shorter than that, to finish within the hour, but we just wanted to earmark the time in case we were running over with questions. If there are more questions than we've time for, we'll certainly take those on board and for future engagement and consider how best to address these, whether it's through guidance, Q&A, or another webinar session. So really, to start the formal presentations this morning, I'll hand over to my colleague Niamh, who will talk through the regulatory aspects. Over to you, Niamh.
Hello, good morning, everyone, and thank you to everyone who's attending today's session. You're all very welcome, and I hope you find today's session both practical and useful. As Nicola mentioned, my name is Niamh Herlihy, and today I'll be talking to you about the interruptions or discontinuations of supply of certain medical devices. For ease of language, I'll refer to these as supply shortages throughout the presentation. So just to provide an overview of what we'll cover today, I'll be speaking to you about why shortages arise. I'll also provide an overview of the regulatory context relating to device shortages and explain why this topic is currently in focus. I'll also talk about what a shortage notification is and subsequently how shortage notifications work. And from there, our colleagues from the HSE will explain their national process for managing shortage notifications. So when we think about product shortages and why or how they may arise, it's often used to think about the possible causes. So it clearly goes without saying that there's an endless list of causes, but typical problems might include manufacturing or quality issues, raw materials shortages, natural disasters, and safety and performance issues. In the context of device shortages, loss of compliance has now become a key risk to the continued supply of certain medical devices. And in my next slides, I'll explain why this is the case. So when we talk about compliance, I guess it's useful to explain what we're trying to comply with. The medical device regulatory landscape can be very complex to understand, but for the purpose of today's presentation, I wanted to provide a very brief and concise overview of how devices are regulated, as this will help provide additional context to the overall topic and shortages. So May 2021 marked a key date for the regulation of devices. From this date, from this date, a new and stronger and more robust regulation became fully applicable and replaced a previous set of devices. I guess it's just to note that, as was the case under the directives and it now continues under the regulations, all devices must be CE marked and when placed on the market in Europe or used in patients in Irish hospitals. After May 2021, if a manufacturer wanted to place a new device on the market, it had to be compliant with the new regulation in full. Simple as that. So what about the devices then that were already in use before May 2021? These were referred to as legacy devices. And manufacturers of legacy devices can avail of extended time. So these are legally termed transitional provisions to prepare for and meet the obligations of the new regulations. However, in order to avail of the extended time periods, manufacturers must meet specific criteria by certain timelines. So what happens if a manufacturer of a legacy device doesn't meet the specific requirements by the applicable deadlines? Well, the simple answer is they won't be able to continue selling those devices to suppliers or hospitals anymore. And this is where the loss of compliance and subsequent increased risk to device shortages stems from. At EU level, and other EU member states have seen, the EU Commission are aware of the risk of shortages stemming from compliance deadlines. So in response to this, there's been some mitigating measures that have been brought in through the adoption of European law. Regulation 2024/1860 introduces an additional article, Article 10A, to the EU medical device regulations. So in brief, what does it include? A new legal requirement for manufacturers to inform the relevant health institutions before the supply of certain medical devices or IVDs is interrupted or discontinued. So why was it brought in? To increase visibility on device availability issues for health institutions. So while there has been an increased risk of devices at EU level due to the loss of compliance, there has been little transparency to allow for planning among health services. And the aim of the notification is to give more advanced notice to health institutions and other entities to allow for more time to take mitigating actions and ensure continued patient care. So perhaps the simplest way of understanding how the shortage notification measure will work is to think about the who, what, when, and how. Who will notify hospitals of shortages? What will hospitals be notified of? How will hospitals be notified of shortages? And when will hospitals be notified of shortages? So we can start by asking ourselves, who will notify a hospital in the event of a supply shortage? The answer to this is you should receive a notification from the entity who supplied you with the device. So if you source an effective device directly from a manufacturer, the notification will come from them. Alternatively, if you source it indirectly from a supplier, either an importer or distributor, it will come from the supplier. I will note that the manufacturers who are also required to notify the competent authority of the country where they're located in the event of a shortage. So manufacturers based in Ireland will notify the HPRA. However, we would anticipate that hospitals would be notified of the shortage before we are. So when we think about what information hospitals will be notified of, there's two types of notifications to be covered. We have supply disruptions, which are a temporary nature, and these would typically last 45 days or more. And I just to highlight that 45 days is currently, it's the thinking in terms of the current time frame, but this is still being discussed at EU level. And then we have discontinuations of supply, which are more permanent in nature, and the device would no longer be available on the market in the long term. So for each type of shortage, manufacturers are required to notify relevant parties at least 6 months prior to the anticipated starting point. But I guess in reality, this may be more ad hoc as the requirement comes into place and depending on the issue at hand. So it's useful to think, I guess, what the scope of the notification is, So what will hospitals be notified of? Would they be notified of shortages for all devices? And I guess the answer is no to this, because hospitals will only be notified of shortages for devices where the lack of supply of those devices could lead to serious harm to patients or public health. So that's to say, where the absence of a device could be life-threatening or could lead to serious deterioration of health. The potential for serious harm to patients in this context is not assessed based on individual patient case. Rather, the harm should be considered based on the effect on the patient population. Now, I'd also note that before notifying, it is expected that the manufacturers would carry out a risk assessment. But on the other side, it's also important that hospitals take care to assess the notification based on your setup and your availability of supply. So when will hospitals when the notification will start, when it will kick in? The European legislation was introduced in June and was adopted this year. And so from June to January 2025, the requirement for manufacturers to notify will be on a voluntary basis. But from the 10th of January in 2025, this requirement becomes mandatory. I guess the reason why it becomes mandatory at the 10th of January is to allow time for affected stakeholders to develop the required systems and procedures needed to fulfill the requirements effectively. So in this regard, we would anticipate that come the 10th of January, we would possibly see an influx of shortage notifications immediately after it becomes mandatory. And it's just to make you aware of this and just to prepare your processes for this. So just to summarize, I guess, what we cover is the challenges with transitioning from the EU directives to the regulations, and how this has led to a loss of compliance and posed an increasing risk of medical device shortages. The legal notification has been brought in due to the need for action to ensure the continuation of patient care. And I guess it's just to note that the requirement has been applied through the experience learned through Brexit and COVID, and what we've seen from the lack of transition to the regulations over the last number of years. And up to now, there's been little visibility from manufacturers to allow for the mitigation measures for shortages. And we would hope that this notification requirement is a practical tool that would be a benefit to healthcare professionals in hospitals. So I leave it there. Thank you for listening. I hope it's been useful, and I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A session. But for now, I'll pass back to Nicola to introduce her from the HSE.
Thanks very much, Niamh. I think that was a very useful overview of the background for why we're in this space around new notification requirements. And if you don't mind, there's just one correction in terms of the timeline there, just to confirm that from June 2024 to the end of this year, that it'll be voluntary notification. Yeah. And then I guess the mandatory requirement comes in on the 10th of January 2025. Yeah. So that's just a small note. And then I might just hand over now to our colleagues from the HSE, and would like to introduce Dr. Ger Flynn. And Ger is the National Clinical Head of Medical Devices with the HSE, and Ger is going to talk to us about the national process that the HSE have adopted for receiving the notifications and for assessing and communicating on those. Thanks, Ger. I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Good morning, everybody. I'm Ger Flynn. As part of this information session, the element that I will address is what actions are to be taken by a site when it's notified of a supply disruption or a shortage. As you can see from this first slide, a supplier is legally required to notify their customers of a supply disruption or a shortage from the 10th of January onwards. Next slide, please. If you are notified of a disruption or a shortage, you'll need to populate this template and return it to the email at the bottom of the slide. That's medical devices regulations@hse.ie. It's important that each of the fields are completed. This gives us better visibility of the product. The fields are the hospital, the equipment description, the product code, the model, the manufacturer, the location on the site, the estimated volume, which is pretty important, of the product purchased per annum by that site, the supplier and their contact details, and if that particular hospital has sourced an alternative compliant product. Next slide, please. This slide illustrates the process of how a notification is to be managed by the HSE. So if you look from the very top of the slide and work downwards, the first step is if a site receives a notification, the site populates the template that was shown in the previous slide and sends it via the email to the steering committee. And this is to be done for all notifications that each of the sites receive. And that gives us a sense of the quantity that's coming in. So the second step is the steering committee responds to the site and logs the notification details and then notifies HSE procurement. Here then, the HSE procurement makes contact with the supplier to determine the level of exposure. If you look to the bottom right-hand part of the slide, if it's a single site is affected, then that local site procurement manages the situation and sources a compliant alternative, and then provides feedback to the steering committee to say that particular issue is addressed. If it's multiple sites are affected, the national procurement manages the situation and sources a compliant alternative, and then provides feedback back to the steering committee and of course, to the affected sites. Thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation.